Hello writers of the world, welcome back to the Agent Mo channel. I'm Agent Mo, an author and former junior literary agent. I am so glad you're back with me today to learn more about the publishing world, the ever-changing publishing world, and the crazy rules that govern it. And for that reason, today I'm going to be talking about a topic that is often ignored, if not and it's usually not a deliberate thing. A lot of people don't necessarily know about this, but I think it's important to learn about this while querying, actually even before you start writing your book, because it's important for the marketing procedure. And I know I say this a lot, but the market has everything to do with your writing. If you are interested in publishing traditionally or even self-publishing, you have to keep the market into consideration. A lot more on the traditional publishing side though, because you're going to be dealing with agents and you're going to be dealing with editors. Now, before I start talking about this topic, I want to thank my subscribers again, and I hope I'm providing important, vital, necessary information for you that'll help you in your publishing journey. And if I do, please leave a comment down below expressing this. And if you have any questions or topics that you think I should cover, let me know. And for my other viewers, please like and subscribe and click on the notification button. That way you can receive notifications about future videos that I upload to the channel. All right, so the topic we're talking about today is word count. Last time I spoke about comp titles, which is something that's also very important, specifically to the marketing of the book. Today I'm going to talk about word count, which is something that you should keep in mind when you start working on your book. And the reason why I say this is because the word count will determine how an agent will sell a book to an editor, a publisher, and if that publisher is going to buy it. Now, why is that important? Why do editors need to know what the word count of your novel is? They need to know how many pages your book is going to end up being, because the number of pages, well, pages cost money. So a publisher is going to spend a certain or have a certain cost for your book based on the number of pages you have. And chances are, if you are a debut novelist, a debut author, you haven't really proved yourself in the market yet in order to be able to write books that are longer than a specific genre or longer than whatever genre you're writing in. That means you have to be hyper aware of the word count that you insert into your novel, not too short, not too long. And for that reason, I'm going to talk about the various genres and their word counts. Now, before I do that, I also want to talk about the temptation to overwrite. And the reason why I say this is because a lot of debut authors, amateur authors, usually think that their books will become the exception. And this isn't me trying to say your book will not be an exception. This is me saying you have to be realistic, you have to play by the rules before you can overlook them. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you are a debut author and you haven't yet written a book or you haven't yet published a book that the market really loves, and by market I mean your audience, then it's going to be a lot harder to justify why you overwrote or underwrote in a specific genre. And for that reason, the editor is going to have a harder time buying it, publishing it, or selling it, because it's either too long or too short. But you can't really start off with an exception unless you have a really good reason. So, without further ado, let's talk about the various genres of books and their word counts. The very first thing I want to talk about, the very first rule is, if you're writing a novel, novels usually range between 50 to 110,000 words. So as long as you're in between those word counts, you'll be fine. Now, depending on the genre, you can't really go above or below that limit. And to a certain extent, there are some genres that you can't really hit that upper mark, the 110,000 words. So the very first genre I'm going to talk about is the adult and literary fiction. And this is adult commercial / literary fiction. And these two are very different genres, and I'll talk about those in a different episode on their own. But the adult commercial and literary fiction usually ranges between 80,000 to 100,000 words. And there are articles that explain the differences between these genres and why the word counts are so different. And I'll plug those in down below for your reference. I've used these references extensively for all of my novels and all of the works that I've published or wrote. The second category is science fiction and fantasy. This is where we usually see a lot of writers. A lot of writers usually write. There are a lot more books that are science fiction and fantasy published every year, and the reason why is because science fiction and fantasy books carry a much bigger story, a more epic story, and there's a lot more world building in them. So it's a lot easier to justify a higher word count. So their word count is between 90,000 to 120,000, sometimes a little bit above. And again, it depends on the agent, it depends on the editor, and it depends on the story. So as long as it's between 90,000 to 120, science fiction fantasy works because there's a lot more required of it in terms of world building and character building. The third category is romance and its subgenres. And the romance and its subgenres, and by subgenres I mean like erotica, or historical or contemporary romance, they usually range between 40,000 to 100,000 words. And again, depending on the subgenre, that will determine what the word count is going to be. The fourth is historical fiction. Historical fiction ranges usually between 80,000 to 100,000. It usually isn't too much outside of that range, and the reason why it can get up to 100,000 is because there is also another level of character building and world building that's involved, specifically due to the historical context and locations that we have never really visited. The author has to kind of do extra research in order to build up that world. So it's kind of similar to the fantasy and science fiction in that area. The fifth is the crime, mystery, thriller, and horror, and these usually range between 70 to 90,000 words. And the reason why it doesn't hit above 90,000 to 100,000 is because, well, it needs to kind of hit the suspense aspect, the suspense element. And suspense usually requires quickness. So thrillers, mysteries are usually quick. You want to get to the punchline right away, and you want to do that in the least amount of words possible, which is why the minimum is 70,000 words. And the maximum is 90,000. Then we have young adult books, and young adult books also differ because young adults or young adult books or the young adult genre is similar to the adult genre in that it has subgenres as well. You have young adult science fiction, you have young adult fantasies, and each one of those genres abides by its own word count. But in general, young adult tends to be between 50,000 to 80,000 words, usually not more than that. And this is where it gets a little dicey, because if you're writing a young adult science fiction or fantasy, it could get up to 100,000 words, depending on the story that you're telling. So don't feel too worried if you're hitting that 100,000 mark. It could be accepted by agents, by editors, depending on the story that you're telling. Then we have middle grade novels. Those are usually a lot shorter because the audience is younger. So the word count is between 20 to 55,000 words. And then eventually we have picture books, which are usually around 500 to 600 words. Yes, you heard that correctly, 500 to 600 words. And that's pretty much what you should know about word counts. It depends on the genre. It depends on the story you're trying to tell. Never assume that you're going to be the exception. Follow the rules first, then you can become the exception after you publish your first book, when you have a lot more freedom to write whatever you want. And we'll talk a little bit about that in other episodes as well. It's not really whatever you want, but you can write as much as you want, because you then have an audience who you can market to and submit to, and who's going to read your material no matter what. Now, we're going to move on to our second section, which is our query letter. I did receive more query letters. Thank you so much to the authors who are sending me these query letters. I truly appreciate them. I really enjoy reading query letters and giving feedback on them. This particular query letter is coming from an author named Lodestar. He did not give his name. That's totally fine. Lodestar writes... in this query letter begins with, complete at 80,000 words, The Right to Rule is a comedic adult post-apocalyptic fantasy that could be called Fire Emblem Three Houses in the attitude and setting of American Horror Story Apocalypse. Theo, a young modern witch, wakes up from magical preservation into a hellish new world where humanity struggles to survive nightly demon attacks. Theo is rescued by Odette, a pushy and prissy ambassador to one of the 3 new nations that have staked their claims across the world. After helping him adapt to the new way of life, Odette presents him as a magical anomaly in order to receive an invitation to meet with the illustrious Prince Van. Against Theo's wishes, she invites herself along with her eyes marked on the prince to help her family regain nobility and status. I'd have to read that one more time. Meanwhile, Prince Van rises up to mediate an accord between the other 2 warring nations. Egos and nationalism destroy any hopes of peace until the conclave is cut short by a vision of demonic invasion, the likes of which they haven't seen in centuries. The dignitaries race to the other side of the world and reignite a long-dead campaign against the demons. This is very action-filled, which is really good. Theo and Odette must work together, and with the petty world leaders, to save what little civilization they have left, and from Lucifer himself. All right, The Right to Rule features an ensemble cast of diverse characters, each with their own individual struggles that demonstrate how the human psyche copes and adapts. This is an own voices novel that features LGBTQ, neo-diaspora, adoption, PTSD, anxiety, and minority cultures. Going into the details here, that's really good. I have an autobiographical essay published by Intercountry Adoptee Voices. This is a co-authored novel. I didn't know that. This is a co-authored novel mostly featuring my own work. Other contributors are, and then he includes the names of the contributors. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to speak their names out loud or not, but I'm going to leave it at that. Now, let's give a little bit of feedback on this. So there is a lot that's packed in this query. It's very action-packed, which is really good. Now, it begins with an introduction. However, again, I come back to this point where the introduction is not very personalized. It's not addressed to it's addressed to a specific agent. In this case, it's me, but it's not addressed with a personalized message identifying how or why you've reached out to this specific agent and for what reason. Have you read the submission guidelines? Has this been one of the genres that they have requested? So make sure you notify that at the beginning. Another thing is the word count seems to be really good. I mean, this is a fantasy novel, so it falls within the correct word count mark between 80,000 to 110,000. This one's at 80,000. However, the one thing that I'd like to kind of understand is it seems like this novel is packing a lot of plot. So just starting from the beginning, it goes through 1, 2, 3, kind of 3 short paragraphs, which is really good. However, these 3 paragraphs are very rich with information. And what I would say is to the author, make sure that you're addressing the main plot points and the things that are going to snag the agent right away. And again, if it snags the agent, it's going to snag the editor. So make sure that you're hitting those plot points, bringing them out really well. And to a certain extent, I was kind of reading and I got a little lost in some of the information. So just make sure that you're focusing on the most important aspects of the plot and preferably the ones that will snag an agent. Another thing is the comp titles here aren't very clear. I see here it says the genre is also not very clear. It's a comedic, adult, post-apocalyptic fantasy. So there are multiple genres, and I'll go into genres in my next episode. I'll be talking about that. I'll be focusing on genres. But if you try to explain to an agent what a comedic, adult, post-apocalyptic fantasy is, you're going to get some question marks. It's not very clear what genre it is. Is it comedy? I mean, is it fantasy? Is it post-apocalyptic? Because post-apocalyptic is usually science fiction. And that's fine. But you have to make sure that you're focusing on the main genre. And that's how you're going to sell it to an agent. And other than that, the credentials can definitely be shortened. The last paragraph was actually bigger than the plot itself, or than the 3 paragraphs. So I would shorten it down to things that are just going to grab the attention of an agent, preferably things that are relevant to the writing itself. So, all right, eventually, but again, this is it seems like a very interesting book. I would have to read the first 50 pages or the first few pages to determine if it's actually something that I would want to represent or not. But so far, it's a very interesting story. I'd like to see samples of it. And that's pretty much how I'm going to conclude this episode. I hope you've learned something from this wonderful episode about word counts. If you do have any questions or comments, please leave those down below for me. I will address those as much as I can. So far, I haven't been receiving a lot of comments, but that's totally fine. And if you do have any questions for me, include those down below. For the time being, like, subscribe, click the notification button, and I hope to see you in the next episode. Stick with me. Love you all, and have a wonderful day. Bye.